All right, hello. Um, it's wonderful to be here today with Associate Professor of History at Flagler College, John Young, and I am Assistant Professor of Political Science at Flagler College, Lorna Bracewell. And Professor Young and I are here today to talk about this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. We are both incorporating it into our first year seminar courses. And so we thought, why not take this opportunity to geek out together about a book that we're both excited about and that we're both teaching this semester. So my first question, John, who is Ibram X. Kendi, our book's author, and what is this latest book from him about?
Well, I'd like to say that Ibram Kendi is a history professor and just leave it at that, right? Because we all know that history professors are like superheroes. But actually to call him a history professor, or even to say that he is the Andrew Mellon Professor of Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research there, is not enough, right? Because Ibram X. Kendi is, in my opinion, I think the opinion of a lot of people, one of the foremost public intellectuals in the United States today. And one of the very leading, especially on and issues that are associated with it. And given the moment we live in, with the racial tension that has built over the course of this past summer, with events in a number of American cities and even worldwide, to listen to a voice like this talking about anti-racism, and that word may not, does not necessarily mean what it, what students might think it obviously means, right? There's some layers to this and some nuance to it that we'll get into today, but I think this is a voice we really, really need to listen to. And so the book itself is a bit hard. And I will say, let me back up for a second. He has taught at a number of universities. I actually had the pleasure of listening to a lecture he gave at the University. And that's, to say I know Ibram Kendi is kind of like a fanboy saying that, I know, that's my favorite rock group because I went to a concert of theirs or something, right? But that was one of the best academic lectures I have ever heard in my life. And it was at an undergraduate conference. So this guy is incredibly charismatic and gifted as a writer, as a thinker. And he's definitely somebody we should listen to. So the book is a bit hard to define in terms of genre. It is simultaneously a memoir, a work of history, but I think even those don't get at what he's really trying to do here, which I think most of all, this is an extended, this is a policy prescription. And policy is what he's really after here, right? The reason that he sort of left the rarefied space of the academic discipline of history, in a sense, and took up a position at an academic center for anti-racist research, is that he recognizes as a public intellectual that policy, if we can't change policy, if we can't influence policy, then what are we doing, right? Even as academics. So that's what he's after in this book, and we can talk about some of the concepts that come out of that.
That was going to be my next question, right? You've been discussing this notion of anti-racism, and you intimated that for Kendi, that's a very particular kind of thing that might be different than what we think at first glance it is. So could you tell us about some of those central concepts that Kendi is working with, including his definition of anti-racist?
Right. And so, well, there's a lot to this. And, we've talked in preparation for this about, what are the core arguments of this and what are the most important parts. And, I started by writing down, or at least thinking about, probably a dozen things I could say here. And I think in the short time frame we have, we cannot possibly capture all of that, right? And so I want to encourage students who may be watching this, don't just settle for what Dr. Bracewell and I have to say about this. Please read the book, okay? It's really valuable to read. But two things on the specific question you raised there. What does he mean by anti-racism? He recasts the definition of racist We hear, I think, fairly commonly, I heard this the other day in a conversation with an acquaintance of mine. I heard this when I lived in South Africa immediately post-apartheid in the mid-1990s. We hear this from leading politicians, that they are not racist, right? That's the only time I'll do finger quotes here, okay? Not racist, right? I mean, I heard that from people in South Africa when I lived there who were obviously racist, who would then go on to talk about how Black people were inferior and they should not have been given the right to vote, and apartheid was the only way that society should have functioned, and this was just, their whole country was quickly descending down the tubes, and I mean, it was, so this not racist identifier is problematic, okay? And Kendi calls a spade here and says, we can't say we're not racist, because at the very least, that means that we are trying to be neutral in something that it is impossible to be neutral in, right? The issue of race does not permit neutrality, okay? But at the same time, he redefines racist, or I should say he recasts the definition of racist as a descriptive adjective instead of as an identifying noun. Okay, and so let me read a quote from him here. This is from the introduction. I don't have the page number in front of me. But he says, racist is not a pejorative. Now that alone is a really provocative statement, right? Now, some students may be wondering, what the hell does pejorative mean? It's not wholly a negative thing, in other words. And
it's not an insult.
Right, it's not an insult. Okay, so he goes on to say, it is not the worst word in the English language. It is not the equivalent of a slur. It is descriptive. And the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. The attempt to turn this usefully descriptive term into an almost unusable slur is, of course, designed to do the opposite, to freeze us into inaction. And just before he wrote that, and that's a close quote, by the way, just before he wrote that section, he talked about some, various individuals who claim to be not racist. One of these is Richard Spencer, this white nationalist, who says, "Oh, I'm not racist, but this is why I think that white people should run this country and why Black people should go to Africa or have their own space or whatever." To say you're not racist is, as he says, a ploy to turning the term racist into a slur itself is designed to freeze people into inaction.
And to silence one's critics.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not a racist, so how can you possibly say that I'm doing the wrong thing here or that I have the wrong thoughts? And it stops any sort of productive thinking or productive moving forward with it, right? And so anyway, racist is not a fixed identity, and therefore to be not racist is, first of all, probably a lie. He himself, in his extended sort of meditations on his own experience, says, I have been racist. I commonly throughout my life have acted in racist ways, have thought in racist ways. But I have also endeavored, especially in recent years, to think in anti-racist ways.
Yeah, and I'll add there, some other perpetrators of racism who he calls out in the book, in addition to himself, are his two African-American parents.
Right.
He calls out W.E.B. Du Bois,
yeah.
Right? A kind of titan of Black intellectual history. So it's very clear that he is.
Go ahead, Lorna, sorry.
It's just very clear that in recasting racist as an adjective, he is in earnest, right? Because he is willing to use that adjective to describe the words and the deeds of people who we would not typically think.
And I will say, this is where I was really grateful for this book as a follow-up to his earlier work, which won the National Book Award. I believe he's the earliest or the youngest winner of the National Book Award in history. He was 34 years old when he won in 2016 for his book Stamped from the Beginning, which is a comprehensive look at racist ideas in American history. It goes all the way back to, sort of the early 17th century, talks about the Puritans and the way, anyway, I mean, it's a monstrous work of history, but it's also an incredible book. Certainly one of the best works of history I've ever read. But in that book, when discussing Sojourner Truth, he talks about the "Ain't I a Woman" speech, which is, just this incredible work of rhetoric. And if students haven't acquainted themselves with that, they should, right? Go look that one up. But, he goes through an extended discussion of this in the book Stamped, and then he says, so this racist woman, had these racist ideas. And that really threw me to hear Sojourner Truth called a racist, but he was describing some of her ideas as in this adjectival form, right? That her ideas were racist. This is not a slur against her. It's simply to say that she and Martin Luther King and W.B. Du Bois and all of these people, Abraham Lincoln, all of these sort of titans in the struggle against racism had racist ideas, and that we ourselves all almost certainly do from time to time, but it's not a fixed identity. He goes on to say we can be racist one moment and anti-racist the next, right? And we need to train ourselves, and this is where his prescriptions come in. We need to train ourselves to think and act and argue in anti-racist ways, actively, all the time, right? That's the only way to overcome this racist tendency that we have.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great kind of synopsis of the central arguments and concepts of the book. So thanks for that.
Sure. Well, Lorna, let me take over here and ask you some questions. So first of all, are there particularly important concepts that Kendi employs that you'd like to highlight and explain?
Yeah, so, as you were just describing his recasting of racism as a thing we do instead of a thing we are, I was thinking of the chapter of the book that I found most moving and fascinating was the chapter entitled Dueling Consciousness.
Right.
And that chapter is really about that constant shifting in and out of the kind of realm of racist thought and action. He talks about, he starts by talking about his own experience as a Black man with this phenomenon of dueling consciousness, where on one level, he is totally in love with and enthusiastic about his Blackness. He is totally affirming of the kind of Black culture and Black institutions and Black people who have nurtured him and sustained him. Right, Black is beautiful, right? This is like a strain in his life. While at the same time, he finds himself experiencing a kind of revulsion and disgust at his own Blackness, at his Black culture, at Black people, and a desire to kind of distance himself and escape from that. So, and he characterizes this two-ness as dueling consciousness. He connects it back to W.E.B. Du Bois's idea about double consciousness, right? The kind of experience of simultaneously being very proud of one's racial identity, but also being very ashamed and wanting to escape one's racial identity. So that's the kind of experience of dueling consciousness that he's had as a Black man. Then he goes on, and this is probably the part that jumped off the page and really grabbed me as a white person. He goes on to kind of describe the experience of dueling consciousness that white people have. And there it's a kind of back and forth between two varieties of racism, right? One that he describes as segregationist in character, which is a belief that non-white people are inherently inferior, and that the only option is to sort of segregate them off from the superior white people, white culture, so that white culture can thrive and flourish and not be undermined from within by contamination by the inferior Black culture. So that's sort of one register of consciousness that white people experience, is a racism that takes the form of segregationist ideas. And then the other half of that racist dueling consciousness coin is what he calls assimilationism, which is a rejection of the notion that non-white people are inherently inferior. But it's not a rejection of the notion that white people, white culture is superior, right? The assimilationist holds out hope for the, kind of poor, backward, non-white races, that they can, through concerted effort, through programs of uplift and suasion, that they can sort of come to acquire the attributes that are sort of inherently the property of white people. And, so anyway, the way he subdivides.
They can't be valid doing their own thing in their own way, right?
Right.
They have to join with the majority culture, as it were, however that's defined.
Yeah. And I mean, what I just loved about that chapter and the way he named those two facets of racism is that you realize, oh my gosh, think about our public policy debates in the United States. So much of them just ping pong back and forth between those two racist poles of segregationism and assimilationism. Right. And we never are even able to break out of that endless loop of white double consciousness to really pursue anti-racist policy.
Well, and he goes on to say that even, people of other races, whether it's Black or Latinx or, Asian American or whatever it is, right? We all both, one, participate in a dueling consciousness, but this dichotomy between the segregationists and assimilationists, right? That this sort of runs the gamut across all of these races, and it goes along with one of the key sort of components of racist thinking that he identifies in this book, which is to blame the whole group for the behavior of the individuals. Right. And he says himself as a Black man, especially when he was an undergraduate in college, said, I think I've got white people figured out. They're aliens. They're or whatever it is. They didn't actually come from this place. He was, reading some conspiracy theory stuff, and, that the behavior that he had seen in a few white individuals who acted in racist ways, he took to be indicative of the entire race, right? And obviously, white people have done this with Black people or Latinx people, and continue to do this, right? That we identify the entire race and say, well, you have a tendency to do this, all right? The rates of I don't know, what is it, teen pregnancy or whatever it is, are really high among your group in your race. And so this, it's just a tendency of your entire race or your entire people to engage in unprotected sex, outside of wedlock or whatever it is, right? And all of you have to stop doing this in order to be acceptable to society, right? When actually, individual behavior is individual behavior. We should not cast that upon the entire group from which one comes, obviously. So, right. Yeah, I didn't mean to break in too much there to what you were saying. It's incredibly important. And this, by the way, is one of the things that, he identifies in his works of history are these tendencies, this kind of polarity within, racist thinking in America to move between segregationists and assimilationists. But neither of those, if that's the entirety of the spectrum, we never emerge from racism, ever.
Yeah.
And Kendi says we have to learn to think differently. So yeah, fantastic. What parts of Kendi's book did you personally find most significant, or what parts maybe elicited the strongest intellectual, emotional, spiritual, or other kind of responses from you?
There's so much that you mentioned in your kind of opening remarks, that the book is a sort of combination memoir, history, theoretical work, right? It blends these genres. But I just found the the sections where he describes his own personal history and personal life to be really, really moving. He talks a lot about his experience as a young man with schools, his experience of racism at school and in the context, kind of educational settings. And then later in his life, when he, finally finds himself, I think it's in Temple University, where he does his graduate work in an African-American studies program, and his experience of kind of anti-racist education. So, as an educator, as a professor, my wife is a middle school teacher. I think I found those sections where he discusses, just the racist treatment he gets from teachers at school. We often, I think I'm speaking here as like a kind of like, white liberal. We often think of public education as integral to transforming society in more just directions. And, Kendi is pretty explicit that, schools are institutions of racism in the same way that pretty much every institution in the United States is. So yeah, that was the part that I liked. How about you?
Oh, I mean, his personal experiences are just incredibly powerful. And I especially like how he is so self-reflective, right? That he is able to see with incredible clarity his own transformations. He is not interested, and I think that this is the mark of a true intellectual and somebody who is, has truly arrived in a productive state of mind. He has no desire to justify his own behavior or his own thinking. Right? I mean, one of the great tendencies we have, I think, as human beings is rationalization and justification of our behavior. None of us ever, want to give the impression that we do anything wrong. It's so difficult for us to admit that we're wrong. And when he does this, I mean, and I found myself reflecting on ways that I had acted in racist manner and thought in racist ways, right? And I mean, the formative experience of my life was moving to South Africa when I was 19 years old, and being there for a couple of years and really encountering a culture and a people who were so foreign to me. And I went there, I was working for a church and was going there really with these kind of assimilationist ideas in mind. And I was very much a proponent of what he calls uplift suasion, right? That people can, if they just are taught properly, they can learn how to be productive citizens. They can come into civilization fully and enjoy, reap all of the fruits of this. And, I also talked about myself constantly in that period and subsequently as colorblind, as, somebody who didn't notice the color of a person's skin and all of this, right? And I just recognized in the things that Kendi was saying how problematic my thinking was. Yeah. I mean, and I'm not going to fault myself necessarily, right? This was all part of my own development. And not that, I'm certainly, my experience is worlds apart from even Kendi's, but, I was able to see a lot of wonderful parallels in his experience with my own, in the ways that I, might learn to think more productively about race and especially, this focus on policy, and that, to undo racism is not to try to change people's hearts and minds. It's to focus on policy. Yeah. And maybe we can get into that a little more as we talk about how this relates to, Flagler's core values and all of that. So let me ask a kind of final question here, Lorna, before we delve into that discussion. So Ibram Kendi's book has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 13 weeks and counting. And this is really remarkable for a work written by an academic historian, right? And again, I don't know that we can call him just an academic historian. I think he's much more than that. But what do you think accounts for this book's enormous popularity and Kendi's thinking in general? I mean, what accounts for the respect with which he is held by not just the academic community, but increasingly by the world at large?
Yeah, I think with this book, there's no question that it is the broader cultural moment that we are kind of living through that really spurred a lot of interest, right? The kind of resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And the real, I mean, it's like a global anti-racist uprising, right? And I think a lot of people who had not been a part of that previously want to be a part of it. And so then they go to the Google or, to the book review section of the New York Times or, NPR, wherever they go, and they see a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And they think, I have that question. I need to know how. And, so, I think there's no separating the popularity of this book from this moment. But I think there's more to the book's appeal than that, right? Because it's not a how-to manual. I think the people who pick it up thinking that's what they're getting are, hopefully pleasantly surprised to find that that's not all it is. It's prescriptive, but there's not like a checklist, right? We've kind of been talking about the kind of
come away from reading this book having checked a bunch of boxes and say, okay, I'm now an anti-racist, and that's one less thing I have to worry about, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's about a lot of like critical introspection and self-reflection, and then it's about a lot of like, really difficult and arduous struggles to change policies, which are obdurate, right, things.
Yeah.
So then, I think one of the book's real strengths is it is written to be accessible. It is written in such plain language, and Kendi is explicit about this near the end. He says, I am writing for everyday people. And I've got this great quote pulled out. This is on page 222. He's talking about why he prefers to talk about racist policies as the object that anti-racism is trying to transform, as opposed to institutional racism or systemic racism, which is some jargon that if you're running these circles, you may be familiar with. But he's like, I don't like that institutional racism. I like to talk about racist policies. And he says, why? So he says, I struggle to concretely explain what institutional racism means to the Middle Eastern small businessman, the Black service worker, the white teacher, the Latinx nurse, the Asian factory worker, and the native store clerk who do not take courses on racism, do not read the books on racism, do not go to the lectures on racism, do not watch the specials on racism, do not listen to the podcasts on racism, do not attend the rallies against racism. He is very deliberately speaking to the uninitiated.
Yeah.
And I think that right there accounts to the book's appeal. I think the uninitiated have been desperate for someone to speak to them on this issue.
Yes.
For a long time, and he's stepped up and he's doing it, and people are responding.
Yeah. My wife and I were in a conversation fairly recently, it was a few weeks ago, but with someone, and I brought up the term systemic racism because we were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and things, and brought up, well, the problem is systemic racism. And this person said, well, I don't believe in systemic racism. And my wife and I both just like, after we picked our jaws up off the floor, it's like, how can you possibly say that there is no, but, I'm not sure that, and, it's a very well-meaning individual, and I would not identify this person as a racist or anything like that, right? But, I've had to recast my definitions of all those things after reading this book. But, that is it's a concept, an adjective like systemic or institutional is very jargony, right? And I think that we academics tend to run into problems when we use things like that. So yeah, he's chosen his words very carefully here, and I think you're right that this is a real positive for the book, and one hopefully that students who read this or will wrap their minds around, and it'll make sense to them. So.
Can I preach one more sermon about this? Because this is
Yeah.
really my favorite aspect of the book. He says, what if we measure the radicalism of a speech by how radically it transforms open-minded people, by how the speech liberates the anti-racist power within? You know, again, this like spoke to me. I fancy myself, right, a kind of, you know, whatever, lefty radical trying to do the anti-racist work, trying to set people free, yada, 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 yada. And, you know, but I'm also an academic. I'm also an intellectual. I'm also, you know, trained in feminist theory. I'm also prone to just like sprinkle in the word intersectionality here and there in day-to-day conversation. And, you know, I just felt very convicted. Like, you know, I can feel like, you know, I'm doing the copy edits for my book that I've written. And, you know, I want to go through it. I just want to rewrite the entire thing because I have written an utterly non-radical, by Kendi's definition, piece of scholarship, because it's going to be like totally incomprehensible and totally irrelevant to, you know, 99.9% of people on the planet. And so anyway, I love that. What if we measure the radicalism of a speech or a book or an action by how radically it transforms open-minded people instead of how, you know, woke it sounds?
Well, intersectionality is probably better than something like soteriology, which as a historian of religion to throw into conversation. So anyway, I get that. The struggle is real, no doubt. So yeah. Well, should we talk about how this book relates to Flagler College's core values a little bit?
For sure. Can I ask you, how do?
Yeah, please.
What were the connections? Well, list the. Mm-hmm. Do you have the core values handy?
I do, yeah. So the core values that have, I mean, this is something after a lot of careful consideration, conversations among faculty and administrators. There are 4 core values, as we call them, and everything we do going forward at Flagler College is going to be bound up with these things. So the first one is transformative learning. The second, respectful and inclusive community. The third, citizenship with integrity. And the fourth, thoughtful stewardship. So, you know, I mean, students are going to be hearing a lot about these things, and hopefully by the time they go through their 4 years of education or however long it takes them, that, you know, they will become their bread and butter, right? That they will feel that they are or recipients of all of these things, and this becomes a part of their identity. So, yeah, that's the way we're thinking now.
Yeah, so what were the connections you saw?
So let me talk first of all about transformative learning, right? I think that this book itself is the result of transformative learning. So Kendi is a model of someone who has been transformed in ways that it took a long time, that are complex, that are a bit convoluted, right? And that are still ongoing, okay? So he is, above all things, and this is the way I really want to use the book in the classes I teach, a model of self-reflection, which I think for learning to be transformative, it can't be only about digesting information, right? It's not about the more you know, the better off you are. It's, does this information that you have learned change you in some productive way, right? And so, you know, in order for it to change you, you have to be self-reflective about the information you receive. And, you know, for students reading this book, you might read this and be really put off by some of the things he says. You know, this might even be offensive to you. I don't know, you know, depending on your political bent and your own experience and, you know, things like that, right? But I would encourage you, even if it seems that way, to reflect on it. You don't necessarily need to, you know, adopt everything he says and become exactly like Ibram Kendi. I don't think he himself would say that that's what he wants to happen, right? But if you can be self-reflective about it, like he was in his own experience with racist thinking and racist policy and thinking about racism in general, then, you know, you will have done something good and productive with this work. Let me read another bit from the introduction here. He writes, This book is ultimately about the basic struggle we're all in, the struggle to be fully human and to see that others are fully human. I share my own journey of being raised in the dueling racial consciousness of the Reagan-era Black middle class, then right-turning onto the 10-lane highway of anti-Black racism, a highway mysteriously free of police and free on gas, and veering off onto the 2-lane highway of anti-white racism, where gas is rare and police are everywhere, before finding and turning down the unlit dirt road of anti-racism. Right, so he started out in a dueling consciousness, and then he became an anti-Black racist, right? He says, or that became the dominant frame of his mind, and then he became an anti-white racist, and then he finally reached the point where he can identify himself as an anti-racist, and that took a long time. Right, that took, I mean, the better part of 20 years or more, and that process for him is still ongoing. That is transformative learning, in my opinion. It's a prime example of it. So you wanted to talk about some of these as well. How does this relate in your mind to some of these core values?
Yeah, I mean, the two connections that I saw were between the values of respectful and inclusive community and citizenship with integrity. We mentioned earlier, his definition of anti-racism is basically the belief, and then actions based on that belief, that the races are like equal, like that people are people, that all racial groups are just as flawed and just as virtuous as all the other racial groups. So I think that
doesn't mean they're the same.
No, not at all, no. Right? But in their uniqueness, in their diversity, they are equal. Right? I'm married to a woman who's born in Ecuador and grew up in Miami. The way she makes rice is different than the way my Midwestern American white family makes rice. But it's just different ways to make rice, right? So I think that kind of orientation to racial difference, ethnic difference, cultural difference is really crucial to embodying the value of respectful and inclusive community.
Yeah.
The other value, citizenship with integrity, this connects also to his definition of anti-racism, which, as Professor Young has pointed out, is really oriented around policy, policy critique, policy change. For Kendi, if you want to be an anti-racist, it's not enough to think the right thoughts and believe the right things, or even to speak the right words or write the right book. You need to be politically engaged in efforts to transform policy in anti-racist directions. And I'm just so excited to read a book that centers civic life and political action in that way. Because so often, and this is maybe beyond the scope of our conversation, but, in kind of, modern, postmodern, neoliberal, whatever we want to call it, American society, civic life is not foregrounded in that way, is not figured as kind of central to the good life. So I was really delighted that here we have a book that includes a passionate appeal to citizenship with integrity and civic and political engagement.
Yeah. And that's actually where he arrives at the end, right? The last two chapters are called Failure and Success. And, when it comes down to it, he says, it's not what we think so much as what we do, what we do about the problems we identify in the world. That's how we find success. We can't just talk amongst ourselves and hold these opinions that we feel are right. If we believe in something, and especially if we identify a wrong in the world, to be called a success, we have to do something about it. And actually, we need to be successful at doing something about it. And that often requires a pragmatism that maybe we don't want to have in the moment. he mentioned some of his failures as he sees it in trying to bring about anti-racist policy. And so, yeah, I mean, this is, again, an example of his ability to self-reflect and to think about, himself with clear eyes. And that's, yeah. So let me address thoughtful stewardship, since we might as well cover all of them here.
Sure.
At Flagler College, thoughtful stewardship tends to run parallel to our sense of duty to the historical legacy of the college. We are stewards, for instance, of the historic buildings on campus. There's a big emphasis on historic preservation and things like that at Flagler, right? But I think that thoughtful stewardship has a much broader dimension that is related to citizenship. So these two issues really go hand in hand. In my mind, thoughtful stewardship over our communities, our nation, our world, entails not only identifying problems, as we might be wont to do in the ivory tower, but also of rooting out the causes of injustice, right? And I love that terminology, rooting out, because I've spent a lot of my summer attacking invasive plant species in my yard. And, to get rid of greenbrier or poison ivy, both of which I have fought against incessantly, you've got to tear that sucker out by the roots, right? I mean, it is not easy. Those roots go deep, and you got to dig and dig, and you probably want to. I certainly wanted to give up, and at times I have with these things, right? But to be a thoughtful steward requires being active constantly. We think of stewards over buildings or over gardens or over a polity. Perhaps I think of, the steward of Gondor in Lord of the Rings, for instance, or something, right?
Nerd alert, nerd alert.
Yeah, there we go. I have shown my hand all too well here, right? But thoughtful and effective stewards have to be active. If they're not, the buildings crumble, the gardens become overrun like mine is, and nations and communities decay, right? Or perpetuate the injustices that they have had for generation upon generation. So, I mean, this book really speaks to all four of these core values, I think, in essential ways.
Well, I say we leave it there.
I agree. We have gone on long enough.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Young, for being willing to do this.
And thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
All right, and to all the students out there watching that, I hope that this discussion helps frame the work for you. But like Professor Young said at the beginning of our talk, this is the beginning of your exploration and engagement with Kendi. It's not the end. Please go see for yourself, audit everything that we've said and that we've singled out against your own experience and your own judgment, and arrive at your own conclusions about this book, because that's the whole point of college. So, all right, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.